Not long ago, I turned 16 and immediately found myself entangled in a challenging situation with my parents regarding a trust fund my grandfather had left me, a detail I discovered only upon reaching adulthood. For much of my childhood, my grandparents were my primary caregivers, as my parents often traveled for work. My father was a PMO manager, and my mother accompanied him on his business trips, which allowed me to enjoy a stable upbringing with my grandparents. While I treasured the bond we shared, their absence during my formative years fostered a feeling of neglect that only deepened when my parents settled back in town to open a bakery but did not invite me to live with them. As a result, I stayed with my grandparents for another year. Upon turning 16, my parents demanded that I hand over my trust fund to support their business, threatening eviction if I refused. Cornered and undervalued, I chose to leave. Now, they unfairly label me as greedy when all I desire is to secure my own future, further deepening the emotional chasm between us. Despite their occasional visits during holidays and birthdays, these interactions felt more like obligations than genuine connections. They often seemed more focused on fulfilling a duty than truly engaging with me, treating our conversations with a formality that felt more appropriate for business associates than a daughter. While my grandparents provided a loving home, the emotional distance from my parents has been profoundly painful. I can't shake the feeling that they could have done more to make me feel valued in their lives. In truth, my grandparents raised me, not my parents. While my parents hold the legal title, I never felt a real connection with them. This disconnection has long been a source of heartache for me, a reality I came to understand through painful revelations. One particularly vivid memory comes from my 10th birthday. After a wonderful celebration, my parents were supposed to stay overnight at my grandparents' house, where I lived at the time. As I was heading to my room, I heard raised voices from my grandfather's office. My curiosity got the better of me, and I eavesdropped. What I heard shattered me. My grandfather was confronting my parents about their neglect. He warned them that their behavior could irreparably harm our relationship and emphasized that they wouldn't always be there, eventually leaving just the three of us. Despite no longer traveling for work, my father hadn't invited me to live with them, opting instead to let me remain with my grandparents. The conversation revealed that while my grandparents enjoyed having me, they were concerned about the strange and distant relationship I had with my parents. My grandfather insisted that my parents needed to make a greater effort to engage with me. My father's response was dismissive. He claimed I seemed happy enough with my grandparents and that he was too busy with the bakery to act as a father. My mother echoed his sentiments, expressing her own overwhelm with the business and household responsibilities. They both admitted that parenting wasn't a priority for them while establishing their bakery. That night, I cried myself to sleep, and it became my worst birthday ever. Despite the party, the painful truths I overheard haunted me. It became painfully clear that, to my parents, I was more of an obligation than a priority. This realization has lingered, shaping my perception of our relationship and confirming the emotional neglect I had always felt but struggled to articulate until that moment. The profound loss of my grandparents during the pandemic, who had been my main support system, left me devastated. My grandfather passed away first, succumbing to complications from diabetes, and just 9 months later, I lost my grandmother. Their deaths plunged me into a deep grief that felt depressive. I spent my days in a fog of sadness, barely existing as I watched TV, slept, and occasionally ate. I felt like a zombie, simply going through the motions of life. With nowhere else to turn, I reluctantly moved back in with my parents. Our already strained relationship worsened as I grappled with my grief. I found myself irrationally resenting them, wishing it had been them who had passed instead of my grandparents, a painful acknowledgement of my distress. Even with my father's successful career and the inheritance from my grandparents, my parents remained emotionally unavailable, consumed by their struggling bakery and showing little concern for my mental well-being. They didn't suggest psychiatric help, which I desperately needed, nor did they attempt to engage with me or understand my suffering. Their indifference deepened my feelings of isolation and abandonment. Living with them felt like an ongoing struggle, each day amplifying my sense of being misunderstood and neglected. The profound disconnect between us made it painfully clear that the only people who had truly cared for me were gone, leaving me trapped in an environment where my well-being seemed to matter least. This atmosphere only fueled my depression and resentment, creating a cycle of sorrow and anger. I often felt invisible to my parents, as if I could disappear, and they wouldn't notice until it was too late. It's upsetting to recount how suffocating and painful it was to live with them. However, that all began to change a couple of years ago when things slowly improved. As I started to heal from my emotional turmoil, I opened up to my friends about my strained relationship with my parents. I braced myself for judgment, but to my relief, they were incredibly supportive. My best friend since kindergarten, Ellie, was especially understanding. Not only did she offer her unwavering support, but she also shared my situation with her parents, who kindly extended an open invitation for help whenever I needed it. Their support became a lifeline that truly meant a lot to me. Over the past year, despite my parents' continued indifference, my life has improved significantly. I've learned to cope with my challenges with a little help from my friends. I decided to postpone college to gain some real-world experience, even though most of my friends were heading off to university. I knew I had a college fund set up by my grandfather that I could access once I enrolled. However, I also needed to prove my acceptance to access those funds, as outlined by my grandparents' lawyer. Interestingly, a couple of weeks ago, their lawyer reached out to inform me about an additional trust fund set up by my grandparents that became accessible when I turned 16. This was meant to be a surprise that they would ideally share with me if they were still alive. But unfortunately, the responsibility of delivering the news fell to their lawyer. The revelation came just after my birthday, and in a moment of emotion, I decided to make a social media post expressing my gratitude toward my grandparents for always looking out for me and reflecting on how much I missed them. I thought sharing these feelings online would help me process my grief. However, I quickly regretted making such personal sentiments public. It dawned on me that some emotions are best kept private, as not every feeling needs to be shared with the world. This experience became a poignant reminder of the complex ways we navigate grief and the unexpected consequences of expressing ourselves in the digital age. I should have known better than to overshare, but after posting about my grandparents' trust fund, my parents caught wind of it, likely tipped off by a relative since neither of them is active on social media and I certainly hadn't added them. The very next day, they approached me, an unusual occurrence, as they typically only initiate conversations when it's important to them, often involving money. They began by commenting on how sweet they thought my grandfather's gesture was. Their sudden interest in my post set off alarm bells in my mind. As expected, the conversation soon turned toward their bakery business. They explained they were looking to expand but were short on funds. They suggested that dipping into my trust fund would be a simple solution. They reasoned that they couldn't bring in investors at this time because it wasn't the right moment to sell shares, and they didn't want to risk more of their own money without guaranteed returns. Essentially, they were hoping I would provide financial support without expecting anything in return, essentially a donation to their business venture. I was astounded by their audacity. How could they expect me to simply hand over the money that my grandfather had specifically set aside for my future? They weren't just asking for a small portion, they wanted access to the entire fund to funnel into their business. I firmly told them I would not partake in their plans. If they needed funds, they should seek proper business loans or find investors willing to share the risk. The money from my grandfather was designated for my education and personal growth, not to rescue them from their financial mismanagement. Their frustration mounted as I continued to resist their requests, escalating to a point where my father, visibly annoyed, presented me with an ultimatum: help fund their business or leave the house. This confrontation revealed just how far they were willing to leverage my future for their ambitions, deepening the rift between us and solidifying my resolve to protect my inheritance. My mother coldly informed me that I could either share the funds with them or leave their house, emphasizing that as an adult, they were no longer obligated to support me. The irony of their calling me selfish while they had consistently prioritized themselves over my needs was not lost on me. They framed their ultimatum as a fair choice, reflecting the real-world consequences of my decisions, but I sensed an underlying assumption that I wouldn't be able to manage without them. They couldn't have been more wrong. Despite their minimal involvement in my life, I had grown accustomed to relying on myself, and their latest demand only reinforced my determination. I didn't confront them directly after their ultimatum. Instead, I agreed to think it over, giving myself time to plan my next steps. That night, I quietly decided to leave. I had already discussed my situation with my best friend, Ellie, and her parents, who had become more like family to me than my own. They understood my predicament and offered me a place to stay for as long as I needed. Their support provided the safety net I needed to make a swift exit from my parents' home. Leaving without a word might seem harsh, but to me, it was justified. My parents had never shown me the consideration that would warrant a formal goodbye. They didn't deserve an explanation for my departure because they had never extended me the basic courtesy or care a parent should. Predictably, when they realized I was gone, they were more outraged than concerned. They bombarded me with calls, but it wasn't until the evening that I finally responded. Their questions weren't about my well-being but rather about the trust fund and what I planned to do with it. This response was disappointing but not surprising. I firmly told them I had decided against sharing my inheritance. The money was meant for my future, as my grandfather intended, not to bail them out of their financial irresponsibility. I made it clear that I would not be a charity case. It was a tough but necessary stance to protect my future and maintain my integrity. I had already made it clear to my parents that I wasn't interested in giving them handouts. They had never prioritized me, and now, without my grandparents, I needed to prioritize myself. I was certain my grandparents left me this money specifically to support myself after they passed, and knowing my parents, I decided not to help them financially. That decision was final. Since then, my parents have been stirring up trouble, accusing me of being exceptionally greedy. They've even resorted to badmouthing me to our relatives and their friends. I've been inundated with messages labeling me greedy, which has been frustrating and has led me to question my actions. Despite reassurances from Ellie and her parents that I'm doing the right thing, it's tough, and I find myself wishing for an objective perspective to reaffirm that I'm not being unreasonable. The overwhelming support from lovely comments online about my grandparents has been heartwarming, reassuring me that if my grandparents could see this, they would be proud. As for those reaching out to criticize me based solely on my parents' narrative, I realized I shouldn't take their words to heart. These people don't truly know me or my story, they're merely echoing my parents. In response, I decided to address everyone involved. I posted online that anyone who genuinely supports my parents should consider investing in their business themselves rather than pressuring me to use my trust fund. I also publicly told my parents that their attempts to guilt-trip me were only strengthening my resolve. I made it clear that they were manipulative and selfish, unable to see beyond their own needs. My parents had given me a stark choice: share my trust fund or leave. I chose to leave, asserting my independence. If there's any greed in this situation, it's not coming from me. Their strategy to make me feel guilty has failed. Instead, it has empowered me to stand firm in my decision, sever ties, and manage my life and finances without their interference. After making my feelings clear and publicly addressing those who criticized me, I decided to turn off my phone. I was done with the drama and had nothing more to add to the conversation. I was confident that those I tagged would relay my message to my parents, giving me a sense of closure as I prepared to move on to the next chapter of my life. It was time to start focusing on finding a job and an apartment. I'm deeply grateful for Ellie and her parents' generosity. They've told me I could stay with them as long as I need to, but I feel it's important to stand on my own 2 feet. I don't want to rely on others indefinitely, not after depending on my grandparents, then briefly on my parents, and now on my friend's family. With the support of my trust fund, I'm in a good position to take care of myself, and I'm optimistic about what lies ahead. It's been 4 days since I last posted online, and as expected, everyone I called out has blocked me. They've likely passed my messages on to my parents, who are furious. They sent me a message saying they were cutting ties with me, which I calmly accepted before blocking them in return. This feels like a clean break, and honestly, it's a relief to be free from that negativity. On a brighter note, my search for an apartment is going well. I found a place and will be sharing it with a roommate, which feels like a responsible move. I'm excited about this new beginning and the independence it brings. I've officially moved out of Ellie's house. It was a bittersweet goodbye, especially since she's also heading off to college soon. Now settled in my new apartment, I've also landed a job in the community manager department of an advertising agency. I'm eager to start this new role and hopeful about what the future holds. My parents and I haven't spoken in the past few weeks, and I've been too busy to dwell on past conflicts. Life is genuinely good now, and I'm focused on building a future that would make my grandparents proud.